By the time I got to the hospital, the police were already there. I should have known there was no way the hospital would let me see Jake, but the police were very eager to talk. My tongue couldn't keep pace with my brain, and the gargled mess of questions that I barraged the police with were barely coherent. An officer I hadn't met before raised an authoritative hand to silence me. "Please, sir, follow me. We have some further questions." "Is he all right?" "Sir, if you'd just follow me." I was ushered into a small room and sat down on a squeaky and uncomfortable chair. The officer took his place behind the desk. What the hell was this? What kind of hospital had an interrogation room? The officer was not one I recognized. He certainly wasn't with the two who questioned me earlier. He was older, comfortably so, a good 10 years without a doubt. He was also harder and more experienced. His stony face revealed nothing of his intentions or how much he knew, and I imagined that, unlike the two rookies who questioned me earlier, I wasn't going to find a damn thing he didn't want me to know. "You're Jake's teacher, correct? The one who placed the 911 call?" "Yes, that's me. Is Jake all right?" "No, but he will survive." I couldn't tell whether to be relieved or not. The officer's poker face refused to let slip anything that could calm my fears for Jake. "But he's alive." "Yes. Now, tell me, how did you know where to find Jake? How did you know he'd be here?" "It was a guess. Something your officers asked me about earlier." He held my gaze, revealing nothing and taunting me into carrying on. "Your officers, that is, the infrasound." "Yes, this ghost noise of yours," he interrupted with the tone of a man sick of entertaining the idea that there was anything at play here other than an off-the-rails kid. However, there was the faintest flicker of doubt in his eyes, as though he'd seen something he couldn't reconcile with his foregone conclusion. "The infrasound interferes with your eyes' lenses. It makes you see things that aren't there, terrible things. Jake's text about turning off the noise made me think that he was still seeing them, and that maybe that had something to do with his disappearance." The officer remained stoic. I had no doubt this was a man well versed in allowing criminals to hang themselves with their words, with nothing other than the blunt force of silence. "Then, this morning, your officers were talking to me about the things that were in Jake's search history. Most of it was unsurprising given the nature of the vision and the nature of him being a 15-year-old boy. Then they mentioned some medical terms that he'd been searching for. At first I figured they were for his mom, as she's a nurse, and I didn't see any connection between them and the infrasonic visions." Still nothing. The officer was going to wait until I'd told him everything before he played his hand in return. Out of curiosity, I Googled the ones I hadn't heard of. The faintest twitch disturbed the officer's rigid gaze. "Phacoemulsification," I finally spilt my findings. "It's a form of eye surgery based on using ultrasound to break up cataracts. I saw Jake's logic straight away. I'd fucked up his eyes using infrasound. Maybe he thought he could fix them using ultrasound. I knew with his mom working here he'd know the layout, and maybe even have the means to gain access to the relevant wards. That's when I called you. Now please, tell me what happened to Jake." At this point my mind was almost at its breaking point. I just needed to know what was happening. The officer took his time considering revealing what he knew. Eventually he leaned in close and said softly, "Jake Tandy blinded himself using ultrasonic equipment in the ophthalmology lab. I don't know whether that was what he'd intended to do, but that was the result." My jaw dropped. He directed 2 focused waves of ultrasound into each eye and destroyed the lens and retina. Nurses found him curled up by the still-running machine. When they tried to approach him, he lashed out at the sound of their approaching footsteps and screamed to be left alone. He calmed as soon as he heard their voices, sobbing apologies for his outbursts, saying, "I thought you were them." The nurses said he simply kept repeating, "They're gone. I can't see them. They're gone. I can't see them," as they took him to intensive care. He was smiling. I was going to be sick. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I truly am. I never intended for any of this. Please believe me." Is he... I stammered. "As I said, he will live, but there's no way to save his sight, and he will need extensive therapy." At this point the officer leaned in closer. He had the same look of steely authority on his face that Richard had when he originally questioned me about the other affected pupils. He was mentally searching for something, anything that could be used to pin this on me, but he was falling short. There were no regulations in place regarding infrasound, even in a concentrated experiment, so they couldn't even charge me with professional misconduct, let alone assault. I was free to go. Instead, he simply held my gaze and asked in a bullying tone, "Anything else to tell me?" There were hundreds of things. I wanted to tell him Jake was right. I wanted to tell him we were both being stalked by shadowy beings. I wanted to tell him my apartment was an in-hospital orgy of demonic headfuckery. But I didn't. At this point, I must have already looked insane enough without the truth making things worse. I simply whimpered no, like a kicked puppy. "In that case, you're free to go. But look," he said, softening his tone momentarily. "If you think of anything else, here's my number." I was walking out of the hospital car park when a thought hit me like a brick. Amy! I'd failed Jake, and for that I could never forgive myself. But I could still save Amy. Oh, please let there be time to save Amy. I immediately called the detective. "I'm still at the hospital. Can you meet me downstairs? I've thought of someone who you need to speak to," I told him. When the officer arrived in the cold, comfortingly well-lit hospital reception area, I told him, "You need to send someone to check on Amy Sunderland. She went home complaining of headaches, and she too complained of seeing the same shadows as Jake long after the experiment finished." "I don't see any reports of a missing Amy Sunderland." "She's not missing. She's at home. Her father collected her from school today." "Listen, I appreciate your concern, but I can't send officers over to someone's house to see if a 15-year-old girl has recovered from a headache." "Just please send someone. I don't know her address, but her parents are Lydia and Jim Sunderland. I think she might be in danger. She reported exactly the same symptoms as Jake, just a few hours behind. If she's following the same path, then we might not have long to prevent the same thing from happening again. Please!" The officer fell silent. This wasn't the same authoritative silence he'd used to intimidate me during questioning. This was the genuine sound of indecision. He'd had a shitty night. Just because Jake had been found didn't mean his case was closed, and he still had the shitstorm of having to discover how a missing 15-year-old boy had been able to get access to hospital equipment and blind himself. He was weighing up whether he could justify sending officers to check on the girl, given the crime scene at the hospital. My face must have swayed him. After all, the only reason Jake was found at all was because of my hunch, so he figured it was better safe than sorry. He pulled the walkie-talkie to his mouth. "Send a car around to check on the house of Lydia and Jim Sunderland." "Could you repeat the names?" crackled a male voice on the other end. "Lydia and Jim Sunderland, parents of Amy Sunderland," he repeated. "Sir, I don't understand. You want another car sent there?" came the voice, still seeking clarification. "What do you mean, another?" "2 cars already visited this evening, sir, accompanying the ambulance in order to assess the scene and question the parents." The professional facade the man had put on this morning was dying in front of me. His ashen face looked ready to crumble as the implications sunk in. He looked like he wanted to shoo me away in case I overheard important information, but he didn't. "What happened?" he quizzed the still nonplussed radio operator. "Sorry, sir. I thought you knew." "They don't allow phones in the hospital. I haven't been updated on anything for an hour or so. Tell me." "Sir, Amy Sunderland was found dead in her room this evening. She bled to death after clawing her eyes out. Her parents had left her sleeping off a migraine to go to the cinema and found her when they returned." My world broke. I'd failed Jake. I'd failed Amy. I'd failed everyone. I don't even know what happened next. In a mindless daze, I drifted home. It was almost midnight by this point, barely 48 hours since I'd found that damn article. 2 days ago I'd been a self-pitying teacher with a tough class and a lack of balls. I now had the weight of Jake's sight and Amy's life crushing me. Through the aimless glaze that was my vision, I stumbled home. I didn't care. The shadows in the streets, in the bushes, in the alleys, and between the cars seemed thicker, almost solid, tangible. They seemed to reach for me, grasp me, touch me, grab me. I even felt fingers on my bare skin at times. Chilled scratches ran up my arms and down my neck, but I didn't care. When I got to my door, I opened it and looked into my shadowy flat. The darkness here was alive now. I could feel it. At this point, I don't think even turning the light on could have dissipated the sea of writhing blackness that engulfed my home. It pulsed and swayed and seemed to breathe as I stared into it. It wasn't just figures anymore. It was dozens of them, all dancing and mocking and taunting and begging me to join them. Inky black tendrils snaked out of the doorway and over the hallway walls like branches of some foul tree growing out to produce some fouler fruit. Snakes of writhing black snuck across the floor towards my feet. Whatever I'd brought forth with my little science lesson wasn't going away, and it wasn't letting me go. It still had another 30 kids to claim for my mistakes. I could think of nothing else to sate them. So, as the horrific fingers of what lived in those shadows continued to climb up my legs, I simply walked in and closed the door behind me. I didn't care. "I'm so sorry,"